Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity, and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local independent community radio station that you are tuned to. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour, coming to you again from across the ditch in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but acknowledging Jaggera and Turrbal people as the tangata whenua, as they'd say here, the people of the land. They're in Brisbane where this is being broadcast, and of course whatever people have been living and taking care of wherever you're listening to this from. Today on the show we are going to be talking about the US alliance, Australia's connectedness to the United States of America and all that it means for us, mostly at a strategic military level, although of course the influence of the United States on our culture runs very deep in lots of ways, but we can save that for another time. Today we're going to talk about what it means for our armed forces and whether that's a good thing and maybe what we can do about that. I've got an interview with Clinton Fernandes, who was a major in the Australian Army actually and is still on the books of the military. He teaches strategy at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and he's just written a book called Subimperial Power, which is an attempt to kind of lay out where does Australia fit in kind of global power relations actually, and what does it all mean for us. And it's an amazing interview actually. I'm very happy to share it with you because Clinton Fernandes is quite a blunt person. He's obviously very knowledgeable on the subject of Australia's defence strategy, or as he is happy to call it, our offence strategy. But he's very honest, and we do in fact chat a bit about the use of military jargon and the way it kind of misleads the public and the kind of public discourse around the military in this country. And so stick around, it's an excellent interview. At the end of the show, I also talked to Vince Scappatura, who's from the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, who at the end of last year released a report that they'd been putting together on a people's inquiry into the US alliance. They did a survey of as many people and organisations as they could about the US alliance and how Australians feel about it, and they have collated their findings into a report which you can go and find online, or you can stay tuned till the end of the show when you'll hear Vince Scappatura talk a bit about it. So that's what's coming up. It will be a packed show, so I'm going to get straight into it and start playing my interview with Clinton Fernandes. It starts off with the audio a bit scratchy, but it does get better a couple of minutes into the interview, so hang in there, there's some quality content. So Clinton, today we're going to talk about the new book that you've written called Subimperial Power, but maybe to start off with, can you give us a bit of background about yourself and the work that you've done, I guess, that's led you to the kind of analysis of Australian strategic policy that you've written?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor at the University of New South Wales in the Canberra campus, and I am part of what's called the Future Operations Research Group. The Future Operations Research Group examines the military, strategic, and generally the operational environment that the Australian Defence Force is likely to face over the 5, 10, 15-year period. Before that, I've been doing that for about 15, 16 years. Before that, I was a major in the Australian Army, and I served in the Army for about 15 years as well. So totally, slightly more than 30 plus years of involvement in thinking about foreign policy, defense policy, national security, that kind of thing.
Okay, so let's talk about Subimperial Power, your new book. It's not a new theme for you, I guess, talking about Australia's relationship to the United States. What brought about the book?
Well, I wanted to make sure that we could get a simple but not simplistic understanding of how Australia operates in the world. What's the purpose of our foreign policy? What's the purpose of our defense policy? And it was important, I think, at least as I saw it, to get people out of the doctrinal confusions and the misconceptions in order to see what's really out there. And in this sense, I knew that we've always been called a middle power, and the middle power that upholds a rules-based international order. Whenever you hear somebody talking about Australian foreign policy, you start talking. People talk about a rules-based international order and how we are a middle power, or sometimes a good international citizen. And so I wanted to explain what the rules-based international order was and why it was different from international law, because they don't say we should operate in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter. They always say, well, we should operate as a rule, to uphold rules-based international order. So I wanted to explain what that rules-based order was, and in that context, to show that we are not actually a middle power, and we're not exactly an exploited state either. We are something else, and this is where the concept of the sub-imperial power comes in.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit about, I guess, the analysis in your book and, I guess, what it means for everyday Australians?
Right. Well, when the foreign minister or even the media talk about Australia's role in the world, they talk about upholding a rules-based international order. And I wanted to explain that we are explicitly talking about a rules-based international order in opposition to an international order based on international law and the United Nations Charter. And so the way to understand the rules-based international order is as an imperial order. And let me explain what I mean. When people talk about empires, they traditionally meant the physical occupation of another society and direct rule of it. So the French in Indochina, or Britain in India. The British Raj is where the Emperor of Britain, the King of Britain, was also the Emperor of India. And so that's the direct physical occupation of a country. But the point of imperialism is actually control over another society's sovereignty, its ability to make independent decisions. Physical occupation is just one way of achieving that. And so modern imperialism is about control of sovereignty, not control of territory. And it can control other countries' sovereignty by the threat of force, as well as the use of force, by intelligence operations that interfere with their decision-making, by trade agreements that limit their sovereignty, and by investor rights treaties that limit the sovereignty or the ability of governments to act and subordinate them to the interests of corporations. And so that's an imperial order. And if one accepts that premise, then the United States sits at the apex of a hierarchically structured imperial order. But Australia, in this sense, is not exploited. Australia is a wealthy, powerful country where immigrants want to come here. And so the way to understand Australia is as a sub-imperial power. So we are both powerful in our own region. We are extremely powerful. We are an imperial power in the case of Timor, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and in the past even Fiji. But we are sub-imperial in the sense that we subordinate our sovereignty to uphold a US-led international order. So that's the basic idea.
It's an interesting one because I guess the majority of scholarship and thinking these days is that empires are bad and kind of colonialism has left a terrible legacy. But I think strategically a lot of people would say, well, yes, you want to be on the side of the right side of empire or something like that, the US and
yes.
that. Malcolm Fraser in his book Dangerous Allies talked about Australia as always having a need for an imperial power, that the UK was kind of like our imperial power, and then we transferred to the US, and this was something that Australia wanted. Do you think that people might agree with your analysis but see it as a good thing?
Oh, well, look, I'm not actually presenting it as a bad thing or a good thing. You see, my aim is to inform rather than to persuade. And the idea is that if you explain that the rules-based international order is an imperial order, it's a hierarchically structured imperial system, that's not saying that it's good or bad. It's basically trying to demystify the concept of a rules-based order. So when people talk about why we should support the United States or oppose the United States. That's not really what the book is about. What I'm trying to say is that the rules-based order is not some kind of neutral, benign system, despite its inclusive-sounding name. It is, in fact, an order of exclusion. It's an order of domination. And we are, in fact, a fortunate component of that because we are the junior partner of the most important imperial power. And so that's really what the book is. But it's really an attempt to demystify this idea of a rules-based order, and also to demystify the idea of security. That's the critical aspect of how to think about foreign policy. So, for example, when we talk about supporting the United States, it's always presented in defensive terms. It's a security. We need it for our security. And what I want to demonstrate, with the basis of evidence and logic and argument, is that to say it's security is actually meaningless. It carries no information because everyone pleads security. Everyone says that the military stance is defensive. So, for example, we were defending ourselves in Iraq. We were defending ourselves in Afghanistan. We are now going to be defending ourselves in the Taiwan Strait. We are going to be defending ourselves in the South China Sea. So to say that this is a defensive alliance is actually a mystification. What we should be understanding is that it's an offensive alliance. We were the offensive power in Iraq, the offensive power in Afghanistan. After a while, there was initial justification for some kind of police action to eliminate Al-Qaeda terrorists who were taking shelter in Afghanistan under the Taliban. But after a while, it simply became, an imperial war. And now in Taiwan, it's pretty clear that the United States is weaponizing the idea of supporting Taiwanese self-determination in order to put pressure on China. And we are purchasing, or we are saying we're going to purchase submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, in order to defend ourselves and the United States in the Taiwan Strait. And that is a meaningless statement, which is why we should understand this as an offensive system, not as a defensive system.
I will move on to talking about AUKUS in a second, which you just brought up, but I am interested in this idea that you've brought up there about this jargon of rules-based orders and defence, that there is this kind of opaque obfuscation of language when we're talking about the military, and you've used two very good examples there. Why does it exist, this kind of language, when used to do the public, and what is the effect of this language being used when we talk about strategy or military?
Well, when we talk about defense, right, look, I am not a traditional kind of member of what's called the left. That's not really my position. You see, I'm actually a former military officer, and I now work in future operations research and so on. But I do believe that the purpose of the Australian Defence Force is to defend Australia, rather than, or it ought to be, to defend Australia, not to conduct offensive operations and call them defense. Right? And the purpose of calling it defense and security is to pretend that we are a benign force in the world. Right? But we are not a benign force, for example, in East Timor, where we acted as an imperial power in order to get access to their oil. We spied on them. And when the details of the spying were released, we prosecuted, or attempted to prosecute, Bernard Collaery, the lawyer who disclosed the operation, and an ACIS officer called Witness K. So controlling Timor's sovereignty is not a defensive act. It's an offensive act. It's an imperial act. And if we say that, then the public would never tolerate that. So the term defense and rules-based orders and so on are done really as a tool of mystification in order to provide political cover for what are essentially aggressive, offensive operations. And my position is The public should be told honestly what we're doing. Maybe the public will agree with it, maybe they won't. But it's undemocratic to conduct these operations and mislead the public by calling them defensive.
Okay, let's talk about AUKUS, the newest kind of development in Australia's strategy of imperial dependence. When AUKUS, the announcement came out, it was just so strange and out of the blue that a lot of us didn't really know how to respond. It was kind of like, is this real? Has anything actually changed? What's going on?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what does the AUKUS alliance actually mean for Australia?
Okay, fair enough. Okay, AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US alliance, is essentially a technology transfer agreement. It's not a military alliance whereby the three countries, Australia, Britain, and the United States, agree to defend each other. Right? It's a technology transfer agreement. What technology? The technology of naval nuclear propulsion. How do you acquire nuclear-powered submarines? That's what AUKUS is. It's not an alliance of mutual defense where there's some sort of trigger which allows us to send troops to defend the United States or vice versa. So AUKUS is an agreement to transfer nuclear-powered submarine technology to Australia. Now, that's the essence of it. The reason it was done in secret, I think, is it has a lot to do with the style of the former federal government and in particular the former prime minister. We know now from Nikki Sava's new book about Scott Morrison that many of his colleagues believed that he was addicted to secrecy and to executive authority and to unilateral action. And so one condition that the United States imposed on Morrison as prime minister was that if we agree to do this nuclear-powered submarines thing, then you've got to get bipartisan support. You've got to get the agreement of the Labour opposition. Morrison said he would, but did not do anything of the sort until the day before the announcement to the public. Right? And so that was before the federal election, and the Labour Party, which was in opposition, probably felt it had no option but to say, yep, we'll go along with it as well, because they didn't want to be outflanked politically on the right. But AUKUS itself is, I believe, a way to keep Australia more dependent and to prevent Australia actually having an independent defence policy that is integrated with our region. Rather, AUKUS is going to make Australia dependent defensively and integrated with global NATO, not with our region.
And this all is very relevant now, as the news daily at the moment is filled with stories about Taiwan and China. I guess this is where the pointy end of Australia's position as a sub-imperial power to the US comes out when we talk about global conflict and things like that. What do you think? Yes. What does it mean for Australia in this stage with a potential action around Taiwan?
Well, your focus on AUKUS in that respect is very appropriate, because here's the thing. I'm of the view that submarines are absolutely essential for Australia's defence. We are an island nation, and about 95% of our trade by weight moves via the sea, the rest via the air, of course. And submarines are essential for securing trade routes, for deterring an adversary. And if the future Australian government decided that it wanted to have a more regionally focused, independent defence policy, that policy would require submarines. We need submarines to defend Australia. But we don't need nuclear-powered submarines, right? So conventional submarines are ultra-quiet. In fact, air-independent propulsion submarines are quieter than nuclear-powered submarines. Nuclear-powered submarines are actually noisier. They have noisy meshing gears between the turbine and the propeller, and their reactor cooling pump has always got to be left on. It can't be turned off. And so it's quite noisy compared to conventionally powered air-independent propulsion submarines. Furthermore, these nuclear-powered submarines are very expensive. The estimated cost is 8 boats for $170 billion. We could buy 20 ultra-quiet conventional submarines for $30 billion. And we could develop the technology and the servicing and the engineering to maintain them over the life of the submarine. And we would not be alone. So Germany, which is an advanced technological power, Italy, also an important industrialized power, Portugal, Spain, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, all have air-independent propulsion submarines, conventional submarines, because for them, those submarines are for their defense. Nuclear-powered submarines are not relevant to Australia's security. Their purpose is to integrate Australia's Navy into the United States Navy in order to put pressure on China and perhaps go to war in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Conventionally powered submarines are absolutely essential for our security. I can't imagine an independent defense policy in the absence of submarines, but nuclear-powered submarines are not there for the defense of Australia. They are there in order to make the Royal Australian Navy essentially, a part of the United States Navy, and that's the problem with it. Now, once again, if that's the way it goes, then that's fine. But the public should be told what the purpose is, what the real purpose is. And I don't believe that's occurring. The public is not being told what these submarines are going to do and why they are not relevant to the defense of Australia.
Are there concerns, I mean, in a changing global order, I guess, where there are, potentially changes happening? I mean, if Australia's attachment to the US that we have through these submarines, through the US bases on our country, our strategic dependence, could it lead us into trouble in the future if things change?
Yes. Look, we are not actually buying submarines, despite the fact that that's the claim. What we are doing is subsidizing the US Navy's submarine budget so that they set up those boats in Australia. They are nuclear powered. We do not have a domestic nuclear industry. There is a non-proliferation treaty which requires inspections, and so we aren't going to allow that, which means essentially the United States is going to be doing all the submarines. Now, if you, for example, were to buy a car, but that car could not be repaired, maintained, serviced, upgraded in your own city. You had to go and send them off to, say, I don't know, Indonesia or New Zealand to do it. Then essentially, you're not actually buying a car. You are subsidizing somebody else's car industry to set it up in your city. And that's what we're doing with these submarines. Now, what would happen in the event of these sorts of shooting wars? The submarines would be accompanied by Australian frigates. These frigates have about 170 to 180 sailors on board. Those frigates are very vulnerable in the event of a shooting war if they come within range of the Chinese coastline. A short-ship missile could sink a frigate, and we could lose 170 to 180 sailors in an afternoon. Now, we lost about 40-odd soldiers in Afghanistan over about 2 decades of fighting there, our longest war. We could lose more than triple that in one afternoon. And what's not been contemplated is the sociological fracture that this would cause, right? So imagine if you lose 170 sailors to a Chinese surface-to-ship missile, and the public is being told we are the ones being defensive, and they're the ones being aggressive. We're not being told the truth, that in fact we are acting offensively. Well, the effect on people of Chinese heritage in Australia would be very traumatic. You could expect attacks on public transport, calls for some Chinese people to be interned in camps. The sociological fracture would be terrible. And that's not been contemplated. That's never actually been up for debate or discussion. There are other problems with it, of course, which is that you can imagine the wall-to-wall, understandably, wall-to-wall interviews with schoolmates, high school teachers, parents, children of the dead sailors, and that would fundamentally change the temperature in this country. And all of that could be avoided if we stayed out of AUKUS's naval nuclear propulsion technology and acquired conventionally powered submarines. You could get 20 ultra-quiet ones for $30 billion, rather than 8 American boats or British boats for $170 billion. And plus, you had much more to spend on other things, not just defense, but on health and education and things like that, infrastructure.
Yes, well, that does bring me to the next question of what, in your vision, does an independent, I guess, non-sub-imperial Australia look like?
Well, a foreign policy is basically the external expression of your own domestic structure, whether it's economic, political, or whatever else. And you can't have an independent defense policy or an independent foreign policy unless you have, when you've got a dependent economy. And much of Australia's exports and so on are really primary products, we tend to export the raw materials so that other people elsewhere can manufacture smart things, and we buy them. We then buy those smart things. So we happen to be extremely rich in critical minerals, which are rare earths and things like that, which are absolutely essential for a high tech world and for the green energy transition. What we could do is set up a national critical minerals company and then invite companies from the United States and the European Union to come to Australia, use those critical minerals, but transfer some of the technology to us so we can manufacture smart things ourselves, right? The ambition should be to see us as more than simply a quarry, or just an oil field. It should be to try and develop Australia and help us climb the technology ladder, make smart things and things like that. And our foreign policy and defense policy would then absolutely require us to have a defense force that can defend. Right now, the Royal Australian Air Force, parts of them are basically developed to be wings of the United States Air Force. You'd have to have purchases that are more relevant to us rather than simply designed to support the United States in the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, fighting wars in the Middle East or somewhere else. You'd have to have a defense force that was oriented towards the defense of Australia, not just a continental defense, but the sea lanes and trade routes and so on. And that's what it would look like. It would look like being integrated into the region, into regular exercises with Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, rather than 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what the last 20 years of a non-sub-imperial power foreign policy would have looked like. And that's not been done. You could have had, for example, Australian officers going to study in Indonesian staff college and vice versa, Malaysians and Indonesians coming to study here. That kind of regional integration, whilst maintaining Australian independence and a very powerful defence force, is what an independent defence policy would look like.
I'm interested in how the military takes your ideas, given that you were a major in the military, you're still involved, but you're quite critical of very key decisions that have been made militarily. I mean, what's been the response to you and the things that you've said?
Well, we're speaking in November 2022, and the book only came out last month, so there hasn't been much response. I think people in the Defence Force are getting ready to, wind up for the end of the year and so on, and maybe they'll read it over the Christmas break. But the Defence Force is apolitical, and that's not really, I don't expect them to change policy. That's a decision for the public, and it's a decision for Parliament, or it ought to be, and for the government, because the Defence Force is apolitical, and that's a very good thing, and it simply implements the policies of the elected government of the day. But in terms of the reception at the military strategic technical level, yes, it's been positive. Basically, the people I've spoken to understand that the argument is sound. Right? It's not their role to implement defense policy. It's to sort of formulate defense policy. That's a political idea. It's a political role for the government and Parliament. But at the level of technical understanding of how one develops an independent defense force, there is agreement. There is no real doubts about how one does this.
Well, I guess the question then is, politically, is there scope for change, or does the US influence hold so tightly to Australia's political class that, the change isn't possible?
Yeah, well, I think change is possible here for this reason, and there are a number of reasons, actually. One is the prohibitive cost of these nuclear-powered submarines. Just imagine, I just want to re-emphasize this, 8 boats for 170 billion versus 20 for 30 billion. In terms of cost, there's no doubt that we shouldn't be getting these boats. But also, and given the fact that the world is reeling from supply chain shortages and it's a period of austerity, there are obviously trade-offs that have to be made. And I think there's politically, there are good, sound arguments that can be made. But also, it has to do with public awareness, which is why you and I are talking and people are listening, so that they can demand that this matter be debated in Parliament, that it be debated at Brisbane Town Hall, for example, that information events be held, rather than simply presenting the decision as a fait accompli and everybody expected to simply go along with it.
Okay, thanks very much, Clinton. Is there anything else you wanted to leave us with?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope you get to your 12 senators in Queensland and various members of parliament to demand that these things be debated in parliament. And it may well be that the public supports AUKUS, which is fine if that's the case. I have no problem with it. But I just don't like the idea of misleading the public under the grounds that this is some sort of defensive system, and it's not.
All right, thanks, Clinton. And how can people get the book if they're interested in finding out more?
Oh, I guess I just go to a bookshop, you know.
All right, thanks very much, Clinton.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Here on the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, I was talking with Clinton Fernandes, who is in Australia's defence milieu. He was a major in the army. He still does strategic policy for defence, and he's written a book called Subimperial Power, which you can read if you're interested in finding out more detail about what we talked about, where he, I would say, is fairly critical of the US alliance and where it might take Australia. He's at least honest. He does say that the Defence Force is apolitical. I don't know about that. I see politics everywhere, but at very least he sort of says that it's up to the Australian public to try to influence the way that our military strategy will go. And at the moment, the more powerful the US influence gets in that sector, then the less power the Australian public has. And so that's one of the reasons why he wants things to be debated openly and honestly. That's one of the things I'm trying to do in making this radio show today as well. I think it's very important too, and our mainstream media is so weighed in favour of the interests of big corporations, which often have ties to the US and its military-industrial complex, and tied to, I guess, the voices of kind of patriotism and xenophobia and warmongering, which have so often been prominent parts of not just our society, but many societies. And so there's a lot of work for us to do if we want to influence society in another way. Clinton's done his bit for now by writing that book. And so I guess we need to figure out what the rest of us can do to try to influence change before it's too late. And that leads me to the next interview, which is with Vince Scappatura, who's from an organisation called IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. It's a bit of a coalition of different groups that are trying to, I guess, change that discourse. And they have just released a report based on what they call a People's Inquiry about the US alliance. I think this kind of thing is very important, because we need to find some way of breaking these discussions out of just kind of intellectual circles or academia or things like that, and try to work out how can we get political power from the average person who doesn't believe in fighting American wars or serving America's imperial interests. How do we turn that into political power? And for that we need people other than just writers and commentators. We need to talk about social movement building. And so IPAN's People's Inquiry is a start. Let's have a listen to Vince.
So my name's Vince Scappatura. I teach politics and international relations at Macquarie University, and I was also one of the lead panel members for the release of the new IPAN report, the Independent Peaceful Australian Network report on People's Inquiry into Australia's alliance with the United States.
Yes, I'm interested in talking about IPAN's recent report. So first off, could you tell us how did the report come about and what was the idea behind it?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so this has been at least kind of 2 years in the making. There was lots of concern among IPAN and what IPAN was hearing from its very extensive kind of activist network, that most of the mainstream media discourse is dominated by elite perspectives on the alliance, which are really very kind of pro or kind of in favor of an ever closer relationship with the United States without much kind of critical thinking. And yet there is a subsection of the Australian population that does have real critical concerns about Australia's alliance with the United States and where it's heading us. And so the idea was there should be an avenue for those voices to be heard within the broader Australian discourse. So a People's Inquiry was established, and it took public submissions. It was a really great response, in fact. There were around 300 submissions from all across Australia. And it wasn't just your typical kind of national security commentariat types. I mean, there were, academics and journalists and others were interested in this space, making very important submissions too. But most of the submissions were just from ordinary Australians, civil society groups and organisations that are generally, critical of the alliance and Australia's defence policy, but they don't get an airing generally in the kind of mainstream media. So that was kind of the reason for the origins of the inquiry.
So what were some of the findings?
Right. So I've got a copy of the report in my hands right now. It's a very comprehensive document. It runs for just over 100 pages, and there were two aspects to the inquiry. So one, as I mentioned, was kind of questioning Australia's pursuit of an ever closer relationship with the United States, looking at what the costs and consequences of the alliance are. So that was one part of it. And the other part of it was looking at what the alternatives could be. Yeah, so in terms of the issues, highlighting the issues with Australia's alliance with the United States, I'll probably focus just on the section that I was a panel leader for, which was military and defence, because that's the area that I'm most familiar with. So I think there were a lot of areas of concerns about sovereignty, concerns about Australia being dragged into another kind of disastrous war with the United States, as we have been for, in decades past, particularly in the context of kind of the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, with the United States, withdrawing from the Middle East, more or less, and pivoting to the Indo-Pacific region and kind of gearing up for preparations with conflict with China. There was a real concern within the submissions about Australia being dragged into such a conflict. As I mentioned, there was concerns about sovereignty, about the level of integration between Australia and the US militarily, economically, diplomatically, in terms of intelligence integration, that is leading to the hosting of US, ever-increasing US bases and forces in Australia, particularly north of Australia. That this is leading to a situation where it will become almost impossible for any future Prime Minister of Australia to say no to the United States if they asked us to support a war with China over a conflict in the South China Sea or over Taiwan or something like that. There was also concerns about the way that Australia's Defence Force is structured to act as a kind of adjunct to the US military. That as a result of the alliance, we buy these very exquisite, expensive military and defence systems that can neatly integrate or play a niche role in whatever war plans the United States is drawing up, but then aren't particularly useful for the kinds of contingencies that would require the defence of Australia and the Australian continent, the Australian air and maritime approaches. And it's not only about concern that we're structuring our defence forces, to be an adjunct to the US military and not for the purposes of the defence of Australia, but also we're prioritising the wrong threat. I mean, the greatest threat to the well-being and security of Australians is not China. The most important priority is climate change. Climate change is undoubtedly the most significant defence and security issue and environmental issue, of course, for Australia moving forward. And yet our defence establishment seems to be totally oblivious to that, and all the focus is on China. And I think that is it's symptomatic of our relationship with the United States, because that's where the US focus is, and so inevitably that's where our focus is. So that was some of the key concerns that came out of the report.
One of the other things you've emphasised is Australia as yet abstaining from the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and that could be something that could change.
Right, yeah. So this is another consequence of Australia's alliance with the United States, undermining our own security and global security. The only existential threats to Australia are climate change and nuclear war. And yet it's on these two areas that Australia is either not doing anything or moving backwards, or in fact being obstructionist. And particularly when it comes to concern about nuclear proliferation, where we're being obstructionist. And we're being obstructionist because of our alliance with the United States. So there is a monumental treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that was negotiated through the United Nations and done so through a very important Australian advocacy organisation, ICANN. And Australia has refused to sign that because of its concerns about imperiling our relationship with the United States and because of pressure from the United States.
So signing that treaty is one of the recommendations in the report, of which there are many, and I guess our listeners can go and read that report. But I guess the other question is about power, about how can those of us who are critical of the US alliance kind of enact that in a society where there are very powerful forces that bind us to the US.
Right, yeah. I mean, the US alliance has kind of deep and broad support in Australia among the national security elite. And the kind of pro-alliance discourse really dominates mainstream kind of sources. But of course, even at the Australian public level, I mean, survey after survey shows that the majority of Australians, when asked do they support Australia's alliance with the United States, and what kind of feelings they have towards the ANZUS Treaty and our relationship with the United States generally, there's a majority support opinion for that. But when you dig down deeper into the survey results and you ask Australians questions like, should we join the US in a conflict over China, in a contingency over Taiwan, or in the South China Sea, there is strong opposition to that. And so there's a kind of a disconnect. I think the Australian public seems to be somewhat confused because there's support for the alliance, but not really a good understanding of where the alliance is likely to lead us. And yeah, I mean, the options available to activist networks are the usual ones. It's the kind of thing that IPAN was doing with this inquiry, just kind of using our own kind of networks, our own tapping into those people who are have those concerns and doing as best we can to amplify those voices.
Okay, thanks very much, Vince.
Thanks, Andy.
That was Vince Scappatura there, politics lecturer at Macquarie University, and like our other guest, Clinton Fernandes, somebody who has written a book about US influence in Australian politics. His book was called The US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy. No fancy metaphors there. And he was talking about the IPAN People's Inquiry into the US Alliance. IPAN's the Independent Peaceful Australia Network. You can read that report on their website, ipan.org.au. You can also order a hard copy of it through that website, and there's loads of other resources on there if you are interested in finding out more info. And of course, you can also read Clinton Fernandes' book Subimperial Power, wherever you get your books from, either bookstores or libraries, of course, always a good option. And yeah, certainly the American influence in Australia is something that we need to talk about for a few reasons. One, of course, is that we've already foolishly been led into a couple of disastrous American wars in recent decades, failing to learn from the lessons of Vietnam, and we are quite possibly going to be led into another one in China. And one of the other reasons being that it is possible that even if every Australian said that we didn't want to go to war with China, that the American military is so hardwired into our own military infrastructure that we wouldn't be able to say no, or that we would be the subject of one of the many American imperial takeovers that has happened in the last couple of centuries. And I think when we talk about, imperial powers, that is one of the things to remember, that ultimately it comes down to blunt power, and America hasn't been afraid to use that in the past. And so for the very sake of, I guess, freedom and sovereignty as a nation, I'm not a big fan of nations, but it's certainly better than lack of sovereignty being controlled by an overseas power. There's lots of reasons why we need to talk about American influence in Australia, and why, again, we need to talk about movements for change. How can we influence change? Because there's a lot of very powerful people that are very tightly interwoven into American power. And so for ordinary people like you and me, we need to work out what strategies we've got in our toolbox. That's all we have time for on the Paradigm Shift for another week. Hope you enjoyed the show today. Of course, we'll be back next Friday with more important things to talk about. I'll see you then.